Stewart Patrick is a senior fellow. I'm going to find his bio here. I've got it here. There he is. At the Council of Foreign Relations, senior fellow and director of the Program on International Institutions and Governance. His areas of expertise include multilateral cooperation in the management of global issues, U.S. policy toward international institutions, including the UN, and particularly the focus today, challenges posed by fragile, failing, and post-conflict states. We've been chatting. He's had an interesting background. A DPhil from Oxford, found himself in the policy planning staff at the State Department from 2002 to 2005, an uneventful period in American foreign policy in which he found himself with the portfolio for Afghanistan, amongst other things, climate change, global issues, and a lot of things that some people were or were not listening to or paying much attention to. He's also served as a professional lecturer in international relations and conflict management at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's taught at New York University. He's a graduate of Stanford, and then went to Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And he is author or editor of 5 books, including Weak Links, Fragile States, Global Threats, and International Security, which is on sale out front, and he will be happy to sign your copy at the end of the session today. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stuart Patrick. And my public apologies, because I have to go teach a class, so if I sneak out, it's not because he said something bad.
Right, or that he disagreed with. Thank you, Sky. It's a tremendous pleasure to be able to be in Colorado Springs. This is my first time here. It will not be my last, seeing how absolutely gorgeous this place is. And it's a particular pleasure and honor to be able to get out of the bubble that is Washington, D.C. The council has its headquarters is in New York. It has another office in Washington. It does have a national program, but truth be told, we don't do a nearly good enough job of actually getting out of the New York-Washington Amtrak corridor and actually speaking with a wider group of Americans, all very prominent, all very interested in foreign affairs. So I take this as an extraordinary opportunity and really look forward to making this presentation and to getting your feedback during the question and answer session. The book that Sky mentioned has really been the work that I've been, it was the product of several years of work. As Sky mentioned, when I was at the policy planning staff at the State Department, I was, among other things, responsible on the policy planning staff for some policy input with respect to U.S. policy in Afghanistan. But I also, in the wake of, shall we say, some difficulties that the United States encountered in Iraq, in stabilizing Iraq, I was a member of a small team that helped put together a post-conflict reconstruction unit at the State Department, which was an effort, in a sense, to try to compensate for some of those gaps that were so absolutely apparent, particularly in issues of transitional security and governance in the aftermath of the deposition of Saddam Hussein. While I was at the State Department, there was a whole lot of emphasis placed on weak and failing states, and this was also international as well, as being sort of hotbeds of, and disproportionately the hotbeds of many of the major transnational security threats that we face around the world. And I would put, some language that would find its way into Colin Powell's speeches, et cetera, and others were doing the same with their senior officials. And when I left the State Department, I wondered whether or not the things we had been saying had been true in terms of how dangerous and what a threat to international security weak and failing states were. And so that was really the genesis of this book, was to try to figure out if that was true and under what circumstances. And so what the book does is it tries to get a better look at what we mean by this concept of failed, or I prefer to use the term fragile or weak states, which fall along a large spectrum. What is the relationship, what do we mean when we talk about a fragile state, first of all? And then what is its relationship to 5 major transnational security threats that have dominated much of the global agenda over the past decade? And those are transnational terrorism, of course, But in addition to that, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, transnational crime, which is a huge issue, obviously, just look to the south on our border with Mexico, energy insecurity, and then infectious disease, particularly the threat of global pandemics. I think it's safe to say that the last 20 years, which are often referred to in the sort of unfelicitous phrase as the post-Cold War era, could also be known as the age of failed states. After decades of confronting Soviet power, the United States suddenly found itself enmeshed, by hook or by crook, over and over again, in dysfunctional governance in the developing world and some of the ramifications of that. When you think about some of the basket cases that have occupied us in U.S. foreign policy over the recent years, you can think about Afghanistan, obviously, Somalia, Haiti, Liberia, Pakistan, Yemen, to name just a few. And this new preoccupation began in the early 1990s, particularly in the wake of the collapse of Yugoslavia and other parts of the Soviet Empire, but then also outburst of some tremendous violence, not least in Rwanda, that really showed us the horrors that can happen when countries collapse into themselves. And so this notion of the notion of a new world order suddenly seemed like a new world disorder. And the emphasis seemed to be less on great power competition, although that remained, but rather than countries that had too much sovereignty, if you will, countries that had too little sovereignty. And so for analysts in Washington, it became a big thing was to look at these indices or indexes of state weakness. And the most famous of these, which you may be familiar with, comes out every year from Foreign Policy magazine. It's called the Failed States Index. I did a similar one in 2008 with a colleague at the Brookings Institution and an old friend from junior high school days, who's gone on to bigger and better things. And her name is Susan Rice. And I say, by the way, that I was a year behind Susan in junior high school and high school, a year behind her at Stanford, 2 years behind her at Oxford, and now I'm light years behind her. But when we were I was at the Center for Global Development and she was at Brookings, we collaborated on something called the Index of State Weakness in the Developing World, which was an effort to try to rank all 141 developing and transitional countries according to their relative institutional strength. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But the reason that people were doing these sorts of things is that there was an assumption that these countries are, in a sense, the weak link, the soft underbelly of global security. And you see this. This has definitely transcended the Bush administration. Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, before he left his position in Foreign Affairs, said that I think in 2010, he said that if a U.S. city is laid waste to rubble, or huge numbers of Americans are infected by a biological agent, the chances are greater than not that will have emanated from an ungoverned territory around the world. Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, has made many similar statements and actually justified the intervention into Libya to prevent that country from, quote unquote, becoming another Somalia. You've had this, and you've also had this internationally. You've had it within the UN system amongst a lot of US allies who are looking at this. Now, what I found in my book is something a little bit more contrarian and controversial, and that's that the brutal truth is that the vast majority of weak, failing, and failed states pose threats primarily to their own inhabitants and not to the United States or to global security. When governments around the world cannot function or deliver to their own citizens, those countries, the inhabitants of those countries face a much, much higher level, obviously, of civil violence, internal conflict. They're the lion's share of humanitarian catastrophes, whether man-made or, in the case of Burma, after Cyclone Nargis, sort of a combination of natural and man-made. They're the overwhelming locus of UN peacekeeping operations around the world. And from a development perspective, the bottom billion that you've heard so much about are really the inhabitants of the world's fragile states. You see this if you look at statistics of how close countries are to the Millennium Development Goals, which are some internationally agreed goals about basically human development indicators. And no matter how you look at it, people in these countries are more likely to be poor and malnourished, to experience pervasive insecurity, endure gender discrimination, be ill and die young. I mean, you think of a country like Nigeria, which notwithstanding its incredible resource riches, suffers, as so many countries that have resource riches, from the resource curse. In Nigeria, the government, let's just say government and private, the per capita spending on health care in that country is $10 a year. The average life expectancy in that country is 46 years of age, coincidentally or not my own age. You also think about a country like Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe has taken a country that used to be, in some sense, the breadbasket of sub-Saharan Africa and had just tremendous potential and has driven that country systematically into the ground. Now, beyond those living in those countries, the next heaviest brunt of weak and failing states is really borne by the region. And you see this in places like the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, where you've had different militaries and irregular forces going back and forth between many of the countries of the region. You see these interlocked conflicts ever since the genocide in Rwanda occurred. You see it also in Central Asia, in the area of the Fergana Valley. And then you also find that even one country falling into this category of fragile state can have tremendous economic consequences. It's even estimated by former World Bank economist Paul Collier, that the cost of one country going into this sort of fragile state category can cost itself and its neighbors as much as $85 billion in terms of lost growth over the course of a number of years. Now, that's a gargantuan sum. That's 70% of all official development assistance given by all wealthy countries in the world every year. So it's a huge loss. But again, as I'm saying, it's largely restricted to the inhabitants of those countries and their neighbors. I guess the point that I came out with in this book, which was counterintuitive, is that although we think about the world as being interdependent, and it obviously is tremendously interdependent in a lot of ways, that when it comes to some of the weak and failing states that aren't particularly connected to the global economy, the world is a little bit more like Vegas than we might think. That what happens there often does actually stay there. And so I think that's probably the most counterintuitive finding of the book. Now, the failed state threat, the notion of the failed state threat, really emerged, as I said, in the 1990s in the wake of some of the state collapse issues. The journalist Robert Kaplan, who writes a lot for The Atlantic and other magazines, wrote a famous article that he turned into a book called The Coming Anarchy. And this was about how sort of the world was increasingly going to resemble, what was Sierra Leone at the time, just a sort of very Hobbesian situation, red in tooth and claw, and that this was going to spread from some of these zones of anarchy would increasingly engulf the rest of the world. And it struck a chord with the Clinton White House. In fact, they set Al Gore among his many duties as vice president. He became the head of something called the State Failure Task Force, which would try to anticipate when countries would go to hell in a handbasket. But it has to be said that in the 1990s, it remained largely an academic exercise, and it was excoriated in the pages of Foreign Affairs as being sort of foreign policy is social work. These are basically third-tier national security concerns. We've got to focus on the big powers and also the Middle East. And so during the 1990s, I think when it came to weak and failing states, they tugged at our heartstrings sometimes, particularly in the aftermath of these great tragedies like in Rwanda. And sometimes they loosened our purse strings, but by and large, again, we considered them third-tier national security issues. That changed fundamentally after 9/11. The ability of al-Qaeda to launch the most devastating attack on the United States in the history of the United States was just a watershed moment in terms of changing threat perceptions in the United States. And it's encapsulated most notably in the 2002 National Security Strategy, which came out, I think, the day or two after I joined the policy planning staff at the State Department. And that was in the statement by President George W. Bush that the United States is now threatened less by conquering ones than we are by weak and failing ones. And the Obama administration has redoubled this focus as well. It's an interesting point of continuity between the two administrations. And you see this in a number of ways. The regional combatant commands that the Department of Defense maintains around the world have increasingly been preoccupied with what they call phase zero operations. Now, for people who aren't familiar with the military, every war plan has a number of sort of phases, going from sort of initial planning to going through to sort of phase 4 post-conflict, phase 5 even, sort of stabilization and basically a return to steady state. But the military, in its infinite wisdom, thought, well, it's a lot, prevention is worth a pound, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Maybe we should start focusing on trying to prevent state failure in a lot of these countries. So that's where the sort of Orwellian term of phase 0 really comes in. But it's an interesting trend within the U.S. military that they're actually, and largely a hopeful trend, that the new Africa Command, for instance, or the U.S. Southern Command is actually focusing on what do we do to look at sort of long-term trends. You've had the CIA, which has identified over the years, at least 50 so-called ungoverned spaces around the world that could be havens for terrorists and other illicit actors. You've had an effort within the State Department and USAID to create a civilian expeditionary corps of civilians that would be able to go out, in a sense, alongside the U.S. military in some of these circumstances. Now, sometimes, though, the threats get to be a little exaggerated. And there's one example that I want to read from sort of the breathless prose of the U.S. Agency for International Development document about the dangers posed by fragile states. And it goes like this: when development and governance fail in a country, the consequences engulf entire regions and leap around the world. Terrorism, political violence, civil wars, organized crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking, infectious disease, environmental crises, refugee flows, and mass migration cascade across the borders of weak states more destructively than ever before. I mean, that's about as gripping as it gets, particularly in a U.S. government policy document. And so I particularly after having left the government and thinking, we were writing that stuff. I thought, well, I'll take a closer look. Which also I think is an interesting career strategy, is to write things like that, although I didn't write that, and then once you get out, be in academia or a think tank and be able to sort of analyze whether or not what you said before was right. So it's sort of a complete loop, perpetual employment opportunity for me. A closer look, I think, suggests that the connection between state fragility and global security is far more contingent and complicated than conventional wisdom would have us believe. I think a lot of it's been based on isolated examples and anecdotes rather than sort of a more comprehensive look at broad patterns of where these threats are located. What do we mean by state weakness and state failure? Let's take a closer look at specific case studies and really do some tracing of the processes by which this weakness could lead to some of these problems. And so that's what the book tries to do. It first looks at what we mean by state fragility. It then looks at these 5 major transnational security threats: transnational terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, transnational crime of 6 different types, energy insecurity, and infectious disease. And then it provides some policy recommendations. Now, just a few words on what I mean by weak and failing states or fragile states. I define them in the book as those countries which a state is unable to fulfill what I consider to be the 4 main core functions of statehood, modern statehood. And the first of these is to secure the population from violent conflict and to control their territory. The second is to establish and maintain legitimate, transparent, and accountable political institutions. The third is to foster an environment conducive to sustainable and relatively equitable growth, including an environment conducive to the private sector. And the final aspect is really the provision of basic social welfare services, particularly when it comes to health, education, and water and sanitation, things like that. Now, I want to stress that, what the government should do and what the state should do remains a matter of vigorous debate even in this country. I'm perfectly aware that 100 years ago, the notion that there should be something called Social Security would have been quite controversial within the United States of America. It's now sort of become taken for granted, although its sustainability is another question. So these things evolve over time. This is sort of a Western concept of the state, and yet it's been embraced in many degrees by modern states around the world. I should also mention that when you think about weak and failing states, you have to recognize that a lot of these countries have never really been viable creations to begin with. This is particularly true in the post-colonial world. Now, one can put too much blame on the fact that these countries are the creatures of imperialism. But the fact remains that the borders of these countries were drawn in the chancelleries of European capitals around the time of the Congo Conference in 1885, and they didn't necessarily have considerations of political, ethnic, or economic viability in mind when they were deciding what color that those countries should be, or drawing the straight lines that cut through particular tribes and other social groups. That being said, I think there is some use in trying to measure how strong countries are, and that's what, in terms of their institutional strength, which is really what we mean, and their resilience. And that's what Susan and I set about to do in doing this index of state weakness in the developing world. But in addition to arraying these countries, and the book shows, their rankings, at least that we had in our 2008 version. In addition to doing that, you have to also recognize that it's not enough to just rank countries according to these 4 categories of state function, and that was divided, by the way, into 20 different indicators that are quite well established, drawn from the World Bank and other sources. You also then have to recognize that, like Tolstoy's unhappy families, each fragile state is, in a sense, unhappy in its own way. But there are certain pathologies you can find. Some of these countries are, like Nigeria or Equatorial Guinea, are resource-rich, poor performers because they're suffering from the resource curse. Some of them are post-conflict situations like Liberia, where you've got a well-meaning government, but it's really struggling. Others are sort of prolonged political crisis, like in Zimbabwe. Still others are sort of dysfunctional, aid-dependent countries that have a patrimonial system of politics. You think of Zambia, for instance, or Bangladesh, perhaps, or even dysfunctional democracies as well. So there are a number of different ways you can slice this. But, and then the final point that I want to make, and just how we think about fragile states, is that it's extremely important for policymakers, when they're thinking about how do we engage these countries, to think about the distinction between capacity and will, between the underlying resilience of the country on the one hand and the resources on which it can draw, and its actual commitment to good governance. Because that's important, because that allows you, just at the simplest level, you can think of sort of a simple 2x2 matrix. You can think of those countries that have the will and the way. So just take sub-Saharan Africa. A country like Botswana, or up until recently, Senegal, had both the will and the way, both the capacity and inherent institutional strength, and also the political leadership that was willing to do the right thing. Then you have those countries that have the will but not the way. Liberia under Ellen Johnson Sirleaf would be an example. She wants to do the right thing, she's committed to good governance, et cetera, but she has a very, very tough row to hoe. And then you think of the opposite, those countries that have the way but not the will. And if you take Zimbabwe 10 years ago, when it still had some promise, and then Robert Mugabe has largely destroyed that country. And then you can get to countries that have neither the will nor the way, and Somalia there being the archetypal example. So let's just I'll move on now to look at the threats themselves. What did I find when I started looking, for instance, at transnational terrorism? I think that the major conclusion that I had here is that state weakness is only really of limited utility, really, in trying to help us understand where transnational terrorism is based around the world today. Looking at the index, it's obvious that the vast majority of weak and failing states have nothing to do with transnational terrorism of the al-Qaeda variety. Obviously, that's much more concentrated within the Muslim world to begin with. But even then, in only parts of the Muslim world, and not necessarily in the weakest parts of the Muslim world. Obviously, al-Qaeda and its offshoots have found some sanctuary. The most obvious example is obviously in Pakistan and Afghanistan, the borderlands there, but also in Yemen. But the vast majority, as I said, of sub-Saharan African states have had virtually no al-Qaeda presence. And even in the case of Somalia is an interesting one. It sort of suggests that too weak is bad. That what terrorists want, and this also goes for criminals, is they don't want a failed or collapsed state. They want a state that's sort of weak, but somewhat functional, that is still very corrupt, but is very linked into transportation and logistical networks. And there's a very funny story that comes from the West Point Combating Terrorism Center. There's a guy named James Forrest there who, along with a number of colleagues, got a hold of some intercepted communications between Osama bin Laden and his what he called his Africa Corps, basically a group of of operatives that he had sent out to try to establish a foothold or a toehold in the Horn of Africa in the 1990s, early 1990s, at the same time that we were having such difficulty with peacekeeping operations and the Black Hawk Down episode, et cetera. And what was interesting was that they wrote back complaints that were very reminiscent of what UN peacekeepers and U.S. Army Rangers were writing back. They basically said, these people are impossible. They are clannish. The logistics here stink. It's impossible to transfer money. There's no operational security. I mean, what this place needs is an Islamic, basically led state-building project to try to create this place so that it's actually going to be hospitable to Al-Qaeda activities. And sort of, it smacks you in the face that with the fact that it's very difficult for terrorists to operate in such an environment, and it's easier for them to operate in a place like Pakistan or in Kenya even, which have some, which are highly corrupt societies, but are more links, have greater links. Another thing when it comes to terrorism is that the attitude of the state is all important. We tend to make this distinction between state sponsors of terrorism versus countries that just can't control areas. And therefore the terrorists can operate there. In fact, what we found, I think, over the last 10 years with our good friends in Pakistan, is that sometimes the truth is a little bit more complicated than that. And the reason why Al-Qaeda has found such a haven in Pakistan has a lot to do with the fact that the Pakistani government, and particularly the Pakistani intelligence services, have over the years wanted to cultivate jihadis for their own purposes, not least their confrontation with India over Kashmir. And similarly, in Yemen, the Saleh, the president, for a long time cultivated Sunni extremists for his own internal political purposes. So that's that's an important thing. Another thing is that it really depends on how hospitable the local population is to terrorist groups. You see this in the U.S. government has been quite worried that Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is going to be a huge problem. In other words, in the sort of the Sahel region of Africa, sort of just below the Sahara. But when you actually look at it, there's actually been not much traction there for this group. And the reason is, in part, is that region is very heavily influenced by a more moderate version of Sufi Islam, which, and although their Wahhabists have made some inroads there, it just has not had the same kind of traction that you get in Pakistan. So that's on the terrorism front. I'll move rather quickly and maybe omit at least one of the threats just in the interest of time, but I'll move quickly now to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. There's been a lot of concern that weak and failing states, as Secretary Gates's statement suggested, would be real problems for WMD proliferation, in part because countries would lack the will or the capacity to control the spread of those weapons or related technology, or indeed be pursuing them. And Pakistan here stands out, and the sort of atomic arms bazaar of the Pakistani scientist A.Q. Khan really worried a lot of people, thinking like this is going to be the wave of the future, and isn't this just a reflection of the weakness of the Pakistani state? The more you look at it, though, you really find that there's only two real countries of great concern, with the possible addition of Burma, depending on what its ambitions are. And those are North Korea and Pakistan. They're the only two countries that are weak and failing states with appreciable quantities of fissile material. And they're the only ones where we really have this scenario of rapid state collapse, and suddenly, who knows where those nukes end up and in whose hands they end up. And also some suspicions, particularly on the North Korean side, they might actually sell them to non-state actors. So again, one has to be very careful about, rather than sweeping generalizations, focus on the specific country and see what the dynamics are there. Now, when you look, the more you look, and this is my chapter, looks at WMD, what you find is that the danger for WMD proliferation, and this is true for some of these other threats, including terrorism and also crime, tends to come from countries that are actually ranked slightly higher on this index of state weakness. They're sort of middle-ranking countries. They have governance failures, and they also have enough power to actually do things like create weapons of mass destruction. And they also have motives, also in some cases, to oppose the United States. So you think of countries like Syria, which obviously was working on nuclear weapons until that facility was destroyed. but may still have aspirations. You think of countries like Iran, obviously, and now Russia with many still of its unsecured nuclear materials, and the recent revelations that some of Iran's movement in this direction was aided and abetted by former Russian scientists. So that's the bottom line, basically, on the weapons of mass destruction chapter. Now let's turn to transnational crime. In theory, you'd think, well, God, the weak states would be, they'd be the weak link in transnational crime, certainly, because, there'd be no rule of law, there'd be a lot of opportunities for corruption, no police, et cetera. And to some degree, you find this, but it depends a lot on the type of crime you're talking about. Certainly for the production, as opposed to transit, of illegal drugs, there's a big connection. I mean, Afghanistan, at one point, I think, at the height, I think, was responsible for about 97% of the production of the world's production of opium. And I think it's gone down to about 93% now, but it's still at historic levels. It's sort of off the chart. I mean, you have to probably go back to sort of the era of the opium wars to have one country that is so dominant in the production of one illegal substance. And a plurality of coca is produced in Colombia, which we rank as a weak state. Even though it does very well on certain indicators, the fact that the country can't control 40% of its territory does suggest that it's a weak state. Peru, though, is giving it a run for its money now as well. But if you look at other things like money laundering, there was a thought that, well, these countries will be really hotbeds of money laundering. But the closer you look at it, if you want to launder the proceeds of your illegal activities and you're a criminal, you want a pretty sophisticated financial system to do it in. You'd prefer that it's offshore. The Caymans might be nice, or Palau maybe, but often it's been actually in some of, it's been the city of London as well. And, with the exception of these informal remittance systems like Hawala and others, you really don't find much money laundering occurring in these countries. Similarly, in human trafficking, you'd think that it would be the weakest states, but in fact, it's often authoritarian governments that are a bit stronger in terms of their capacity, and particularly in the Middle East, that are quite involved in human trafficking. So again, you find something quite different. Let me just finally end with on the threats with pandemics. Again, the conventional wisdom would suggest, wow, countries that they don't have any epidemiological surveillance, they have no healthcare capacity, primary healthcare capacity, they don't have any rapid reaction capacity, and they're totally overburdened as it is. Aren't they really the weak underbelly of the global public health system? And that certainly was what I thought. But the more I looked at it, the more you had to think, well, let's think about different kinds of disease threats. And there's no question that when you look at Africa, for instance, that it has a huge disease burden. But the disease burden that it's afflicted with, which does not mean we should not care about it, it just means that it's not necessarily a security threat. It may be a humanitarian consideration or a development threat. But the diseases that sub-Saharan Africa is overwhelmingly afflicted with are endemic diseases. Things like malaria, and those are not ones necessarily that are of immediate security threat. The second category of disease threat is long-wave pandemics, but there's really only one that we really care about these days, and that's HIV/AIDS. But what we found is that at least in the OECD world and the wealthy industrial world, and post-industrial world, that is largely a manageable disease in terms if you can get antiretroviral treatment. That is not the case, obviously, in many of the most afflicted countries where those drugs remain very expensive. The real security threat when we think about infectious disease is pandemic influenza and other types of acute, very fast onset diseases. When I looked at this sort of patterns, I actually found that these diseases were primarily, again, in those countries that are more closely integrated to the global economic system. And I'll get back to crime because it's similar in the case of crime. Because what you find is that there are a lot of really terrible diseases that emerge in some of the weak and failing states, and two come to mind are Marburg and Ebola virus, these just horrific hemorrhagic fevers that are the stuff of sort of Hollywood movies where suddenly after a few days you start bleeding out of your eyes and all of a sudden, just horrific, and they have huge horrific consequences on those that are infected. The good news in some ways is that they burn themselves out very quickly. The other good news is that they tend to be concentrated in incredibly isolated pockets particularly within Africa. And so again, they're not ones that are going to come back and bite the United States. Again, this is not an advice to let them eat cake. This is not an advice to say we can't care about these things. I think that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration are very much to be congratulated for having done so much through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and other medical, and then now the new President's Global Health Initiative for really trying to help strengthen health systems in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. It's just to say, if we're going to be honest about what our concerns are with these countries, we have to think of them more as a humanitarian and particularly a developmental issue. Just to get back to crime for a second, one of the things I was going to say was that as in so many of these other threats, the countries that are most worrisome are ones where, again, you can corrupt them, but they have one foot in the developed world and one foot in the developing world. And an example is South Africa. You know, it's no accident that South Africa is a total hotbed of transnational organized crime, whereas Niger, you know, partly due to its geographic position, but also due to the fact that there's not a lot of business flying through Niger. It is not. In the same way that one thinks about Mexico. Now, Mexico got in the news, has been in the news a lot recently, obviously, for this tremendous drug trafficking. Has something to do with our insatiable demand for illegal narcotics in this country and our sometimes unhelpful habit of shipping weapons down to south of the border, I have to say. But you know, Mexico is by no means a failed state, notwithstanding some of the statements of a few U.S. officials. It ranks actually quite high in terms of functioning. But what this chapter suggests is that criminals will take the higher risks of operating in a country that is like Mexico or like South Africa, that's more capable in return for high profits and access to global markets. And so anyway, that's largely the bottom line of the book. I don't end with the conclusion we shouldn't do anything about these countries. I think it's incumbent upon us for moral, humanitarian, and development reasons to actually spend resources on these countries. I think we have a stake as human beings in the fact that we have a common humanity to actually help care for our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, has described fragile states and the bottom billion who live in fragile states as sort of the hard nut of the global development challenge. We need to try to figure out better ways of addressing these countries. Now, I want to get to Q&A, and we'll probably only have about half an hour to do that, so I won't go through some of the policy recommendations I have, but the last chapter does have a number of them about how to organize the U.S. government more effectively to try to get to helping strengthen institutions within fragile states, notwithstanding these sort of uneven connections with security threats, and places a major emphasis on working multilaterally as much as possible so that we don't duplicate and just so that we're not redundant in terms of what we're doing, and we can leverage the help of others, because particularly when it comes to foreign assistance, we don't live in a world that is 1960 anymore. You know, at about the time of the Alliance for Progress and Kennedy administration, the United States was probably responsible for, 60% of global official development assistance, that is foreign aid around the world. It's a much smaller proportion now that we're responsible for. And if we're going to make a difference, we need to partner with our friends in the European Union. We need to get new non-traditional donors like China, which doesn't always play by the same rules when it comes to its foreign assistance, to start playing by some of the same rules. And we need to work very closely with institutions like the United Nations, and particularly the World Bank and the international financial institutions, which have really the lion's share of the resources when it comes to these countries. So with that, I will stop and invite, I guess, John's going to come up and help me field questions and look forward to any comments that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll take your questions. I'll repeat them for the purposes of the Pikes Peak Library District broadcast. Okay, the question was, is Mexico a failed state? And if not, how do we describe it? And then I'll just add, can we take our students down there now?
That's right. Yeah, I'm not going to take responsibility for telling you to take your students down there right now. This is not, it's extraordinary. It is a challenge to the Mexican state. and the president of Mexico has, declared war several years ago on these criminal syndicates. It is. I don't believe it's. I don't believe it's an existential threat to the state. I think that there are certain these syndicates have carved out certain no-go areas. They have had incredible penetration of many of the law enforcement institutions and even parts of the military. So it is significant, but there's no sense. I mean, I would describe really a failed state as one in which the legitimacy of the government really evaporates, and it loses its. To some degree, it has lost a monopoly on the use of armed force. That is certainly true, but it still remains largely regionally localized. Human insecurity has increased in Mexico, but at the same time, the Mexican economy has been growing reasonably well. It's still, the state is able to provide social services for much of the country. It certainly would slip from where Susan and I ranked it, which was about 90 or so. Maybe even higher. It might slip down into the 60s or the 70s because of the just extraordinarily levels of crime. But I don't see it as a threat to sort of the constitutional system or Mexicans' belief, basically, in the desire to remain a democratic state.
Yeah, the question is, what should former colonial powers do to help the failed states?
That's a very interesting question. A lot of the there aren't that many of them, but the former imperial powers do have a special relationship with those countries. And for a long time, take France as an example, which obviously had huge tracts of land and territories, colonies in Western Africa. For the longest time, there was an emphasis really on sort of strongman rule, in the same way that the United States, for a variety of reasons, within the Middle East, supported authoritarians against both leftists and potentially radical Islamic movements. I think that more recently, if you look at the statements of President Sarkozy, there's been a recognition that that's a losing gamble in the long run. And that because you end up just breeding resentment, and it's not a recipe for long-term stability. I think obviously both Condi Rice and Hillary Clinton in successive administrations have made similar statements on our own policy towards the Middle East. So I think that if you look at French conduct, for instance, in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, where not just UN forces but also French diplomatic and military involvement was really, really important in getting Gbagbo to leave power and to have a transition to having the actual elected leader of that country take office. I think that was a welcome precedent. Britain and France, and to a lesser degree, Portugal has fewer resources, of course, but those countries have actually concentrated a lot of their resources traditionally on their former overseas possessions, and I just think that there's more of an emphasis now on good governance than there has been in the past.
Okay, for those of you who didn't hear it, and for the Pikes Peak Library District, where would we put the United States on the list of failed states, given some of our own problems controlling our interior space and handling our finances?
That's right, yeah, California. Somebody last night when I was speaking at the Foothills World Affairs Council mentioned Greece and where I would put Greece, but let's stick with the United States rather than casting stones at others. We did not, interestingly, rank the OECD countries, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, basically the club of wealthy advanced market democracies in this. I do not think that the United States certainly would not rank first in terms on the good side amongst those 20-something countries, and conceivably even could rank below some others that aren't OECD countries. But it's still, it's all relative, obviously, and there's no question we have some intractable governance problems. You see it every day in Washington. a paralyzed political system in which you have partisan divisions that are preventing any sort of search for the middle ground, and it's particularly hard now, obviously, in the election season, where what are the incentives for either party really to compromise on when the bases of their parties have moved quite to the left and also to the right, one might argue. Again, some of it would depend on how. When it comes to social welfare provision, levels of inequality, how seriously one thinks that's a problem, or whether one thinks that's simply the magic of the marketplace and an inevitable consequence of being a country that's dedicated to the free market, versus those who would say that we need to have greater social welfare, perhaps greater redistribution, more progressive tax code, et cetera. I think that a lot of those are sort of normative decisions that I'm sure people, even in this room, would probably disagree amongst themselves over. But I see us having, we're in a period of difficult governance and facing, political. We need political courage from our leaders to make difficult decisions about what's going to happen for the next generation of Americans. And so far, it seems to me that they're falling short. But I wouldn't necessarily put us as a weak or failing state.
Okay. What effect is China's pursuit of natural resources, especially oil, in the Middle East, Africa, elsewhere, going to have on U.S. foreign policy strategy?
That's a very interesting question. I spent a couple of days last week at a conference in Virginia, sponsored by the National Intelligence Council and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the State Department, which was looking at the future of China, which is, as you know, approaching a leadership transition. Basically, its fifth leadership transition since the 1949 takeover of power in China. And some of the discussion really revolved around, well, what are we to make of growing Chinese assertiveness around the world? In particular, which you're alluding to, I think, is their policy of resource mercantilism, which is, and it's not simply, getting, cozying up to Sudan so that you can get oil and reliable supplies of oil. That's part of it, but it's also, buying huge tracts of land, agricultural land in these countries, sometimes leading to the appropriation of land that farmers have been using for decades. It's a problem for not just for the United States, but I think for governance in those countries generally, because the conditionality, the types of conditionality that China puts on its aid, or in some cases the lack of conditionality puts on its aid, is very different from what the club of wealthy market democracies has done in its traditional approach to development, what we call development cooperation. And there have been a bunch of principles, including Paris Declaration and the Accra principles of development cooperation. And what you're finding is that we really need to bring China into that conversation more, and we need to bring Brazil and India into that conversation as well. I think that the hope is that the Chinese will actually reach some of the same conclusions that, again, empowering autocrats provides short-term gain, but not necessarily long-term stability for what they're looking for. But I think there needs to be a lot of pressure to get away from resource mercantilism and getting more towards sort of a more of a liberal, in the classic sense, approach to markets, global markets for commodities.
How would you place Palestine in the context of failed states?
A fascinating question. We did not include Palestine in our rankings. We thought about it, but because it was not, although it is certainly actively trying to gain membership in the United Nations as officially recognized as a state, we decided to omit it from consideration. It would probably rank as a weak state, not a critically weak state, but as a weak state. But partly, it's kept afloat by a huge amount of resources, not least from the international community. And without those resources, it would be in far more dire shape. Now, it obviously also it would rank very low on political grounds, or quite low on political grounds, because although there has been, an election the country is basically split in terms of its where the political authority is well. I mean, there've been efforts to try to bring sides together, but the still divisions between Hamas and the PLO remain huge, and Fatah remain huge. It's difficult to say until it actually. It would be difficult to rank it along our system until it actually has the opportunity to actually have robust security forces. So, for instance, to tell whether or not it can actually take control over its own territory and its borders as well. And that's going to be a long time in coming. That's unless the Palestinian Authority and Hamas recognize Israel's right to exist, and then that will be the litmus test of statehood. But I would say a weak state right now.
Could I just follow up on a brief follow-up on that? If Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza Strip are included in Israel, how many places in your ranking does that inclusion cost them in the overall chart?
You mean Israel? Israel. Yeah, Israel. I mean, Israel actually was not ranked on our in our index, but it would, if it were, that certainly would cost them quite a bit, because, it would cost Israel on voice and accountability, and a lot of on some of the political criteria there, the sort of second-class citizen aspect of to say the least of Palestinians if the West Bank and Gaza are included within one's definition of Israel. Economically, the tremendous economic difficulties that the Palestinian territories have experienced through recurrent Israeli blockades of produce and other exports from Palestinian territories, arguably justified depending on your perspective in terms of as retaliation for Palestinian aggression against Israel.
What is the role of international financial organizations and I guess other organizations like the WTO in the context of field states?
Was it WTO you said? Yes. I would say that there are a couple of things here that I think, and these get to my policy recommendations a little bit. There are a number of things that the IFIs, the World Bank, International Financial Institutions, for those who don't speak Washington, the IFIs and the WTO can do. One of the biggest things is we talk about aid all the time, but at the same time that we're giving aid to many of these countries, we're taking away often more by not providing access to the exports of these countries. A case in point is Mali. The New York Times op-ed page, or actually the editorial page, had a very interesting series that it ran a couple of years ago called Harvesting Poverty. And it basically was talking about how counterproductive U.S. agricultural policy, and not just U.S. agricultural policy, but also certainly the European Union's protectionist policy towards agriculture is to countries like Mali. Mali is an exporter of cotton. It could be a significant earner of foreign exchange, but the fact is that we protect cotton farmers in this country just like we subsidize sugar manufacturers and sugar plantations in this country in South Florida, because people are quite politically connected. If we are really serious about helping countries lift themselves up by their bootstraps, we should allow them to sell their products in our country. And that goes for other members of the WTO. With respect to the international financial institutions, one of the things that can be done is to provide political risk insurance. That's also the United States can do that through OPIC as well, so that if people want to invest in these countries, that they have, and these are risky propositions, that they maybe can have a little bit of insurance that if they've got some skin in the game, might get a little bit of skin out if things go belly up in those countries. Finally, a couple more things actually. The World Bank has a stolen assets recovery program, which is very interesting. It basically is trying to trace, the illegal transfers of illicit dollars going out that kleptocrats, like the head of Equatorial Guinea, for instance, or Robert Mugabe's of the world, or more recently Muammar Gaddafi. This is an effort to try to make sure that we can get a hold of those things and get them back to the rightful owners, which is of that national wealth, which is the people of those countries. And then finally, the World Bank is beginning to experiment, I believe, with efforts to create mechanisms or financial instruments that allow countries that are quite dependent on commodities, whose prices can be extremely volatile, to actually hedge, just like businesses can hedge over price volatility, so that it's not either it's not either totally sunny or it's a totally rainy day. They can help cushion some of that volatility over time so that they don't get themselves caught in a boom and bust cycle.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patrick.
Thank you.